Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned to talk about classics once again. Once again, we're going to be talking about classics of literature. Recently, I did a video about how much I love Penguin classics, and there was a comment in that video where the viewer said, you know what? The classics I remember were the Signet classics. And those are great, and you should talk about those. That's not exactly what they said, but basically that's what they said. And I said to myself, yes, I should do a video on those. Because for myself and a lot of people of my generation anyway, the way most of us first read classics, it was through mass market paperbacks. The mass market paperback has kind of fallen out of favor, but for years and years, decades, classics, their most popular format was mass market paperbacks. And I'm thinking mostly of the Bantam and the Signet classics. I mean, when I was growing up, I read a ton of those, and I think so did a lot of readers. And a lot of us kind of fell in love with classics because we read them in those editions, those old Signet and Bantam editions, two brands that are sort of interchangeable, but there's a slight difference between the two, which I'll get into. But yeah, those old mass market paperbacks of classics, they were just wonderful. And usually they end up looking like this. I pulled this off the shelf just because it's so tore up. I got a stack of mass markets here. I don't have all of the ones that I own. I have a ton of them, but I brought a bunch over. And I brought this one over just because of how tore up it is and how I think a lot of mass market classics end up looking like this because, a lot of us, we've had these books for years and years and years, and we've read them a bunch of times, and they end up looking like this sometimes. Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. And this kind of, the fact that this has been reread so often, obviously, points out one thing about classics. You will see a lot of people on BookTube and elsewhere talking about and debating why certain books become classics. Why do certain books withstand the test of time and become classics? The fact that most of them are in the public domain doesn't hurt. Anybody can publish a lot of these books which are considered classics. But one thing about them, one reason most of these books anyway have withstood the test of time is because they're really good books and they're really worth reading. Most of them are wonderful books and extraordinary reading experiences. And so a lot of times they end up looking like this. Well-loved classics, mass market classics. And you will still see Bantam classics and Signet classics in the bookstores frequently, but they are far outnumbered nowadays by the trade paperbacks. That just goes for all mass markets. Mass market paperbacks, that's a format I love, but it's certainly fallen out of favor if you compared the current state of mass markets to how they used to be. Now, trade paperbacks, that's the way to go, I think, for a lot of people. People seem to favor those. Publishers certainly seem to favor them. And so you see a lot more of those nowadays than you do the old Bantams or Signets. The first book I ever read, the first adult book I ever read, and I've mentioned this many times before, was a Signet of a classic, and that's this one. This is Dracula. This actually was before Signet decided this was a classic, I guess. It does not have the Signet Classics brand. This is just a Signet edition of Dracula with this magnificent cover. But of course now it is a Signet classic. But yeah, this was my first classic. This was the first adult book I ever read, the first novel I ever read. I read it when I was way too young to understand everything that was going on in this fantastic book, but definitely a classic and a wonderful one. So Dracula, this was my first exposure to real adult reading. And I mentioned Signet and Bantams, but I should mention, since I talked about Penguins the other day, that Penguins did start out as mass market sized paperbacks. And for a while, for a long while, you could find Penguins in mass markets. Like here's Vasari's The Lives of the Artists. This is a mass market paperback. Again, one that has been read over and over again. This has, gone through multiple rereadings and was used in college and all of that business. But it's a mass market from Penguin, and they did for a while. This is a mass market and of dangerous liaisons. Mass market, and you just don't see these from Penguin anymore. They have the larger format, the trade paperback format now, and they no longer, as far as I'm aware, Penguin doesn't do any mass markets anymore. So they've left that field, although Signet and Bantam still do. One of the greatest reading experiences of my whole life was in a Signet classic. This is War and Peace, Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, which is gigantic. It's gigantic. You would think this would be unwieldy to read as a mass market paperback, but not at all. I had a great time with this book, really enjoyed it. I think the translation in here is actually pretty good. This is by Anne Dunnigan. And I liked it. I liked it an awful lot. This was just a wonderful reading experience. And so I've held on to this mass market, even though I have other editions of War and Peace. I've got a few, actually. But I will never let this one go. And I think if I ever read it again, it probably will be in the Signet mass market edition, this very one. I did mention that there's a slight difference between Bantams and Signets, which can, otherwise they're sort of interchangeable in a way. And that is that Signets usually have some kind of introduction to them. I'm sure this one does. Yeah, Signets usually have some kind of introductions, or perhaps an afterwards, or some other kind of supplementary scholarship in the volumes, as opposed to Bantams, which are bare bones. They tend to be just the book itself. This is The Scarlet Pimpernel, which is a book I will be reading later on this year for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. And I just love that cover. I have to say, Bantam has some really nice covers for their mass market classics. This one, I better double check. Usually they're pretty much all the same, the Bantams. They usually have a little bit in front just about the author, telling you a little bit about the author. But otherwise, they go right into the book. And this one's just like that. It just goes right into the book itself. So very bare bones, these things. And it makes me wonder about the future of these. Bantams and Signets, they don't have the kind of variety that that Penguins have. Penguins certainly publish a lot more and a much more wide variety of books. And the same could be said for Oxford's. And I wonder about how these will survive over time. They're still selling them. I think you could still get this one new, for example. But I wonder if they're going to be, over time, completely supplanted by Penguins and Oxfords and other trade paperback versions of classics. And also ebooks, because now with a Kindle, if you've got a Kindle, which a lot of dedicated readers have, you can get this for free, right? This Bantam, it's just the text itself. That's all this is, which is something you can get absolutely free. You can get it for nothing and put it in your Kindle. And then if you prefer to read it that way, you don't need this at all, as pretty as it is. but I like it. And a lot of people still prefer physical books, even if they're cheap mass market paperbacks. And I just think this is wonderful. And I just have such a tremendous affection for these because, I've read so many of these growing up. And this is how I personally, like many people of my generation, was exposed to classics. I have a great affection for them. And so I've held on to a lot of them. Haven't held on to all of them. Some I've got rid of because I do have Penguin editions or Oxford editions, but some I'll continue to hold on to, like this great edition of David Copperfield from Signet. This is how I first read this novel, and most of the Dickens I've read, not all of it, most of it has been in either Signet or Bantam classics. And again, I could remember carrying this around. One nice thing about these, of course, is that they're very portable, the old mass markets. I remember carrying this around and reading it. It took a while to read. I didn't, as slow as I am now, I used to be even slower. And I think, that my first exposure to the classics, I think, is, I think that's how it is for a lot of people of my generation. The Bronte sisters, I think this is the wonderful Jane Eyre, kind of a beat up old Bantam, read multiple times. I probably got this used, almost certainly. But yeah, this is, I'm sure, for many people, the first time they read this book was in a mass market paperback, just like this. Or Jane Austen, for example. I would bet for many, many people, they were introduced to Jane Austen through mass market paperbacks like this one. Again, this is another really beat up one that's been read a million times. This one is actually owned not by myself or Roger, but by the lady of the manor. This is one of her books. And this is her version of Emma. Emma by Jane Austen. I've never read this one. I have never actually read too much from Jane Austen. But I'll get around to that. I'll get around to that eventually. I'll correct that. But yeah, another one that's been read a bunch of times. I should mention that a very convenient way of reading Shakespeare are through mass markets. I've got some old Signet classics. This is an old Signet classic of King Lear. This one, again, belongs to the lady of the manor and not myself. But, I've definitely read King Lear. Don't think this was hers. So I didn't read this in this edition. This is also her copy of Othello. So for a while, the Signet classic Shakespeare volumes looked like this. This one is a little newer. This one is mine. This is Hamlet from Signet. And Signet usually has some very helpful stuff in here aside from just the play. We have introductions. We have a biographical sketch, critical essays. So if you get these Signet Shakespeare volumes, they're wonderful. They have all this extra stuff in them, including the plays themselves. So, if you don't want to read read them out of a massive one volume Shakespeare, these are handy. And again, probably used by billions of students all over the place over decades, these handy mass markets. And I have a few others I dragged down. This is an interesting one because this one is a Bantam Pathfinder edition. This is Captains Courageous by Kipling. And Pathfinder editions were something that Bantam did for a while, but they weren't just classics. They were kind of all kinds of different books they published in the Pathfinder editions. I'm not sure what their criteria were for why they would make a book a Pathfinder edition. I think my copy of Stories from the Twilight Zone by Rod Serling is also a Pathfinder edition. Of course, that is a classic, of course, but not quite in the way we usually think. But this is, definitely a classic. This is a more typical Bantam. Both Bantam and Signet have really good editions of Edgar Allan Poe. This is the Telltale Heart and Other Writings by Edgar Allan Poe. This is a dynamite collection of Edgar Allan Poe stories. This has all of the stories you would expect from Edgar Allan Poe, has a selection of his poetry, and it also has the novel, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. Signet has a volume which I believe is the Fall of the House of Usher and Other Stories, which has a very similar table of contents. They're practically the same book, both the Bantam and the Signet versions. But a great way to read Edgar Allan Poe for the first time. Then I've got Sophocles here, the complete plays of Sophocles in this very handy mass market paperback edition. A great way to read those. And this was an interesting one. This is the complete fairy tales of Oscar Wilde, Signet classic. I don't know, does Penguin have a comparable volume to this? Do they do? They must do this as well, right? Penguin and Oxford. I don't know, but Signet has a very nice edition of the complete fairy tales of Oscar Wilde. Pull down Billy Budd, of course. I think most of Melville's books, if not all of them, you can find in Signet Classics. So there's that. You can, Robert Louis Stevenson, Kidnapped. I don't know. Does Penguin even have this in print anymore? It's been a while since I've seen a Penguin edition of Kidnapped. It seems absurd if they wouldn't have this still in print, but I don't think I've seen one for years. But, you know, you can still get the Bantam. And this is a magnificent book. Now, usually, these Bantams and the Signets, usually these are public domain classics, books that anybody can print. Every once in a while, Signet will pull something else. Here's a book I still have to read, and I actually, before this video, I had forgotten I have it. I must have gotten this around 2011, 2012, something like that, and then just packed it away and completely forgot about it. This is Vampires, Zombies, Werewolves, and Ghosts. My kind of thing. 25 classic stories of the supernatural. And so it's an anthology of creepy stories, which is pretty cool, from Signet Classics. So a little bit unusual for Signet. I think one of the reasons I've probably never really read this is that the first story is Count Dracula by Woody Allen. So the first story in this is a Woody Allen story. And I probably looked at that and said, I'll pick this up some other time. But there are a lot of other really good stories in this. Odd that they would start off with Woody Allen. That would be the first thing in here. But we've also got Ray Bradbury, we got Ramsey Campbell, Charles Dickens, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Joe Hill. Joe Hill is a story in here. When was this published? I feel like I got this like 10 or 11 years ago. 2011. This was published in 2011. I'm assuming you can still get it. So this is one I still have yet to read. And I brought this out. This is Mallory's King Arthur. Every time I try to pronounce this title, I pronounce it wrong. Every time. You could tell me how to pronounce this book, and I won't pronounce it correctly. It's a sad state of affairs, Roger, but it's true. I still have to read this. I still have to read this book. And I'd gotten this Signet Classics version. When did I get this? When was this published? Because this looks like it hasn't really. This was 2010. It looks like when this one was done. So I probably got this right around then, intending to read it. I have this in a couple different editions now. I think I have 3 different editions of this, and this is the mass market Signet. And this might be the one I read when I finally get around to reading this. But this one I still have yet to read, and I just thought I'd do a video just because these are so wonderful. And there you go. I guess that's all I have to say about these fabulous old mass market classics. Like I said, I have a ton of these. I don't have as many as I used to. But they were a huge part of my reading life. I mean, huge. Usually, I mean, for decades, if I were to read a classic, usually it would be in the mass market format. And usually it would be a Signet or a Bantam. That's just usually how I would first read these. And like I said, I think that's the same for a lot of people. Let me know. Let me know what you think. Okay, I will shut up now. I've gone on long enough. I will catch you next time.